The sun beat down mercilessly on the small wooden church outside Salida, Colorado, as Samuel Grant rode his chestnut mare past the whitewashed building, the sound of desperate sobbing stopping him cold in the dusty trail. It was July 1878, and Samuel had been riding for 3 days straight from Denver, his saddlebags heavy with the payment for delivering a herd of cattle to the stockyards. He was bone-tired, his throat parched, and every muscle in his body ached for a soft bed and a decent meal. But that sound, that raw, broken sound of someone in complete despair, made him pull the reins and dismount without a second thought. Samuel was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of working cattle drives across the Colorado Territory. His dark hair hung just past his collar, and 3 days of stubble shadowed his jaw. He had seen plenty in his years as a cowboy, had witnessed death and hardship, and every shade of human suffering the frontier could offer. But something about that crying made his chest tighten in a way he could not explain. He tied his horse to the rail and approached the church slowly, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden steps. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see a young woman kneeling at the altar, her forehead pressed against the communion rail, her entire body shaking with the force of her tears. Samuel hesitated. He was not the praying type, had not set foot in a church since his mother's funeral 8 years ago. But he found himself pushing the door open anyway, the hinges creaking in protest. The woman's head snapped up at the sound, and Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. Even with her face blotchy and tear-stained, even with her honey-colored hair falling loose from its pins, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with wide green eyes that held an ocean of pain. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "I did not mean to disturb anyone. I will go." "You are not disturbing anyone," Samuel said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. "Are you all right, miss?" She laughed at that, a bitter, broken sound that was worse than her crying. "Am I all right? No, I am not all right. I am about as far from all right as a person can get." Samuel took a few steps closer, then thought better of it and stopped near the back pew. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Unless you have $500 and a miracle in your saddlebags, I do not think so." She turned back to the altar, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I came here to pray for a miracle because it is the only thing I have left. My father is dying and I cannot save him." The words tumbled out of her then, as if a dam had broken. Her name was Margaret Adams, and she had come to Salida 6 months ago with her father, a doctor who had hoped the mountain air would help his failing lungs. They had opened a small practice on Main Street, and for a while, things had been good. Her father had seemed stronger and the townspeople had welcomed them, but 3 weeks ago, everything had fallen apart. Her father had collapsed during a house call, blood streaming from his mouth. Another doctor, passing through town, had examined him and delivered the devastating news. Her father had consumption, and it was advanced. There was a sanitarium in the East in New York where they were trying new treatments, experimental things that seemed to be working. But the cost was astronomical, and the journey itself would be dangerous for a man in her father's condition. "I have been trying to raise the money," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I have sold everything we own except the furniture and my mother's wedding ring. I have begged every banker in town for a loan, but no one will lend money to a woman with no collateral. I have exactly $37 to my name, and my father needs $500 just for the first month of treatment, not counting the travel expenses." Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. He thought of the money in his saddlebags, the payment he had been planning to use to finally buy that piece of land south of Denver he had been eyeing for years. He thought of his dream of having his own ranch, of being more than just another hired cowboy drifting from job to job. Then he looked at Margaret's face, at the desperate hope that flickered in her eyes despite everything, and he knew what he had to do. "I will give you the money," he heard himself say. Margaret stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "I have $600 in my saddlebags. I will give it to you for your father's treatment." She stood up so fast she nearly stumbled, gripping the communion rail for support. "You cannot be serious. You do not even know me. Why would you do such a thing?" Samuel had no good answer for that. He barely understood it himself. All he knew was that this woman had been praying for a miracle, and somehow, impossibly, he had the power to be that miracle for her. "Because you need it," he said simply. "And because I can help." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they looked different. "I cannot accept such generosity from a stranger. It would not be right." "Then we will not be strangers." Samuel took a step forward, then another, until he stood just a few feet from her. "My name is Samuel Grant. I am a cowboy from Denver, and I have been saving that money for 3 years to buy land for a ranch. But land will still be there next year and the year after that. Your father might not have that kind of time." "I will pay you back," Margaret said fiercely. "Every penny, I swear it. I will work every day for the rest of my life if I have to. We can work out the details later. Right now, we need to focus on getting your father to New York." Samuel pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. "It is 4 o'clock now. The bank will still be open for another hour. Let me get the money, and we can start making arrangements for travel." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and Samuel could see her mind working, could see her trying to understand why this stranger would make such an offer. Finally, she took a shaky breath and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I do not even know what else to say." "You do not have to say anything." Samuel offered her his arm. "Come on, let us go get your father ready for his journey." As they walked out of the church together, Samuel caught sight of their reflection in the window glass. He looked tired and dusty from the trail, and she looked wrung out from crying. But somehow, walking side by side, they looked right together. He shook his head at the foolish thought and helped her down the steps. Margaret lived in a small house behind her father's practice, a tidy 2-room structure with lace curtains in the windows and a well-tended garden out front. Her father, Dr. Thomas Adams, was a thin man in his early 50s, propped up in bed with pillows, his breathing labored and wet. When Margaret introduced Samuel and explained what he had offered, the older man's eyes filled with tears. "Son, I cannot let you do this," Dr. Adams said, his voice weak. "It is too much." "With respect, sir, I am not doing it for you," Samuel said honestly. "I am doing it for your daughter. She was praying for a miracle, and I happened to have $600 and a good horse. Seemed like providence to me, Dr. Adams looked between Samuel and Margaret, and something passed across his face, an expression Samuel could not quite read. "You are a good man, Samuel Grant. I can see that clear enough. But such generosity comes with a price, whether you intend it or not. My daughter will feel obligated to you." "I do not want her to feel obligated. I just want to help." "Then you are either a saint or a fool," Dr. Adams said, but there was warmth in his voice. "Either way, I am grateful, and I accept your help because I am not too proud to turn down a miracle when one is offered." The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Samuel went to the bank and withdrew the money, then helped Margaret purchase tickets on the stage that would take them to Denver, where they could catch the railroad east. He used some of his remaining money to buy provisions for the journey, and arranged for a wagon to transport Dr. Adams to the stage depot since he was too weak to ride. Through it all, Samuel found himself watching Margaret, struck by the way she moved through her grief and fear with such determination. She packed efficiently, asked the neighbors to watch the house, and made lists of everything that needed to be done. But every so often, he would catch her looking at him with an expression of wonder, as if she still could not quite believe he was real. That night, with everything prepared for their departure the next morning, Margaret invited Samuel to stay for dinner. She cooked a simple meal of beans and cornbread, apologizing for the meager fare. "It is better than anything I have had in weeks," Samuel said honestly. He had been living on jerky and hardtack during the cattle drive, and the warm food tasted like heaven. Dr. Adams ate little, but he watched the interaction between Samuel and his daughter with keen eyes. Finally, as Margaret cleared the dishes, he spoke up. "Samuel, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sir." "What made you stop at that church today? You said you were riding through town. What made you dismount and come inside?" Samuel thought about it, searching for the right words. "I heard your daughter crying. I have never heard anyone sound so heartbroken in my life. I could not just ride away from that." "But you could have offered kind words and kept your money." "I could have," Samuel agreed. "But words would not have saved your life, sir." Dr. Adams nodded slowly. "Margaret tells me you were saving that money to buy land for a ranch. That is a big dream to give up. I am 26 years old. I have time to save again." Samuel glanced toward the kitchen where Margaret was washing dishes. "Your daughter does not have time to lose. You are a rare man, Samuel Grant." Dr. Adams shifted in his bed, wincing at the movement. "I have to ask, though, what do you expect in return for this generosity? And please be honest with me. I am dying, but I am not a fool." Samuel met the older man's eyes directly. "I expect your daughter to pay me back when she can, however she can. Nothing more. I'm not looking for a bride in exchange for money, if that is what you are asking. I would never put those kinds of chains on someone. Even though she is beautiful, especially because she is beautiful," Samuel said quietly. "A woman like that deserves to choose her own path, not feel obligated to marry some cowboy because he happened to have money when she needed it most." Dr. Adams smiled, and for a moment he looked less like a dying man and more like the physician he had been. "You really are something special, son. I hope you know that." Margaret returned then, saving Samuel from having to respond. She poured coffee for all of them and sat down at the table, her hands wrapped around her cup as if drawing warmth from it despite the summer heat. "I have been thinking about the repayment plan," she said, looking at Samuel with those remarkable green eyes. "I am a skilled seamstress and I can take in washing and mending. Once my father is settled at the sanitarium, I will find work in New York. It will take time, but I will pay back every cent." "There is no rush," Samuel said. "Focus on your father's health first." "You say that now, but you gave up your dream for us. I will not take that lightly." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, and Samuel felt a jolt of something electric run through him at the contact. "I promise you, Samuel Grant, you will have your ranch. I will make sure of it." Samuel looked down at her hand on his, small and work-roughened, and felt something dangerous bloom in his chest. He had told Dr. Adams the truth. He did not expect anything in return for his help. But sitting here in the lamplight, with Margaret's hand warm on his and gratitude shining in her eyes, he found himself wishing things could be different, wishing he could be the kind of man who deserved someone like her. He gently pulled his hand back and stood up. "I should get going. I have a room at the boarding house down the street. We have an early start tomorrow." "Samuel, wait." Margaret stood as well, and before he could react, she stepped close and embraced him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head resting briefly against his chest. "Thank you for everything. You have given us hope when we had none left." Samuel stood frozen for a moment, then carefully put his arms around her, returning the embrace. She smelled like lavender and wood smoke, and she fit against him in a way that made his heart ache. He allowed himself one moment to hold her, to feel the warmth of her in his arms, and then he stepped back. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Tomorrow will be a long day." He left quickly after that, walking through the dark streets of Salada with his hands shoved in his pockets and his mind churning. What had he done? He had given away 3 years of savings to a woman he had known for less than 6 hours. His friends would call him crazy, and they would probably be right. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Margaret kneeling at that altar, praying for a miracle. And somehow, impossibly, he had been able to give her one. That had to count for something. The stage left at dawn the next morning, and Samuel was there to see them off. He helped Dr. Adams into the coach. The older man's breathing labored from even that small exertion. Margaret climbed in after her father, then leaned out the window to look at Samuel. "Will you write to me?" she asked. "I want to keep you informed about my father's progress and about the repayment." "Of course," Samuel said, though he had never been much of a letter writer. Where should I send the letters? Samuel thought about it. He had no fixed address, no home to return to. He was just a drifting cowboy who took jobs where he could find them, but he could not very well tell her that. "Send them to the post office in Denver," he said finally. "I will check for them when I am in town." Margaret nodded, then reached out the window and took his hand. "I will never forget what you have done for us, Samuel. Never." The driver cracked his whip, and the stage lurched forward. Samuel stood in the dusty street, watching until the coach disappeared from view, carrying Margaret and her father toward Denver and the railroad and a new chance at life. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, feeling strangely hollow. Finally, he shook himself and went to collect his horse from the livery. He had given away most of his money, which meant he needed to find work, and fast. As he rode out of Salada, Samuel glanced back at the small white church where this had all started. 24 hours ago, he had been planning his future, dreaming of land and cattle and building something that was his. Now those dreams were postponed, maybe indefinitely, and all he had to show for it was the memory of a woman's green eyes and the echo of her desperate prayers. It should have felt like a loss. Instead, it felt like the start of something, though Samuel could not have said what. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Samuel's life. With most of his savings gone, he took whatever work he could find. He hired on with a ranch near Denver, breaking horses for room and board and a small wage. It was brutal work, and more than once he got thrown so hard he saw stars. But he needed the money, and he needed to stay busy so he would not think too much about a certain green-eyed woman traveling east with her dying father. 6 weeks after that day in Salada, Samuel finally received his first letter. He had stopped at the Denver post office on a whim, not really expecting anything, and the clerk had handed him an envelope with his name written in elegant script. Samuel took the letter to a quiet corner of the saloon where he had been staying and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. "Dear Samuel, I hope this letter finds you well. I apologize for not writing sooner, but the journey was longer and more difficult than I anticipated. My father was very weak by the time we reached New York, and I was terrified we had made a terrible mistake. But Samuel, the sanitarium is wonderful. It sits in the countryside north of the city, surrounded by trees and fresh air. The doctors here are kind and knowledgeable, and they immediately started Father on their treatment program. He has been here for 3 weeks now, and I can already see improvement. His breathing is easier and he has gained a little weight. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. I have found work at a dress shop in the nearby town. The owner, Mrs. Hoffman, is a kind woman who was willing to take a chance on me despite my lack of references. The pay is modest, but it is enough to cover my room and board at the boarding house where I am staying. Every penny I can spare goes toward Father's treatment and toward repaying you. I have enclosed $5 with this letter. I know it is a pittance compared to what I owe you, but it is a start. Mrs. Hoffman says that if I continue to do good work, she may be able to increase my wages in a few months. I think of you often, Samuel. I think of that day in the church, when I had lost all hope, and you appeared like an answer to my prayers. I do not know if I believe in fate or providence, but I believe in kindness, and you showed me more kindness than I had any right to expect. Please write back and tell me how you are doing. I want to know that you are well, and that you do not regret what you did for us. With deepest gratitude, Margaret Adams. Samuel read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word. Then he carefully folded the $5 bill and put it in his pocket before pulling out a piece of paper to write his response. Dear Margaret, I am glad to hear that your father is improving. That is the best news I could have hoped for. Please do not worry about repaying me so quickly. Use your money to take care of yourself and your father. I am doing fine. I have work breaking horses for a ranch near Denver, and I have a place to stay and food to eat. That is more than many cowboys can say. I do not regret what I did, not for a single moment. Seeing you at that altar, hearing the desperation in your prayers, that changed something in me. I gave you money, yes, but you gave me something too. You reminded me that there are things more important than land and cattle and building a fortune. You reminded me what it means to be human. Take care of yourself, Margaret. Give your father my best wishes for his continued recovery. Yours truly, Samuel Grant. He mailed the letter the next day and then threw himself back into work, trying not to count the days until he might receive another letter from her. The correspondence continued throughout the fall and into winter. Margaret wrote every 2 weeks, faithfully enclosing whatever money she could spare. The amounts were small, $5 or $10 at a time, but Samuel was touched by her determination. He wrote back regularly, sharing stories about his work and asking about her father's progress and her life in New York. Slowly, through those letters, they began to truly know each other. Margaret wrote about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her mother who had died when she was 16, about her dreams of someday having her own dress shop. Samuel wrote about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about losing both his parents to fever, about the freedom he had found working the cattle trails across Colorado and Wyoming. The letters became more personal as the months passed. Margaret admitted that she was lonely in New York, that the other girls at the dress shop were nice, but she had made no real friends. Samuel confessed that he had been lonely too, long before he met her, drifting from job to job with no real roots anywhere. In December, Margaret's letter brought news that her father was well enough to leave the sanitarium. He would need to stay in the area for another few months of monitoring, but the doctors were calling him a success story. The experimental treatments had worked, and though his lungs would never be perfect, he would live. Samuel sat in his small room at the boarding house, holding that letter and feeling a strange mix of joy and something that felt uncomfortably like grief. He was overjoyed that Dr. Adams had recovered, that the money had served its purpose. But a selfish part of him knew what this meant. With her father on the mend, Margaret would have no reason to keep writing. She would move on with her life, and Samuel would become just a memory, the kind cowboy who had helped them in their darkest hour. He was wrong. Margaret's next letter arrived in January, and the tone was different, more tentative. Dear Samuel, I have been thinking about Colorado, about Salada and the mountains and the clear air. New York is crowded and dirty, and I find myself missing the West more and more each day. My father is doing well. He has even started seeing patients again, working with one of the doctors from the sanitarium who has a private practice in the city. But he misses Colorado too. He talks about going back, about reopening his practice in Salada. I know I owe you so much money still. At my current rate, it will take me years to repay you. But I have saved almost $200 now, and I was thinking about bringing it to you in person. We could come back to Salada in the spring, once father is strong enough for the journey, and I could give you the money then. Unless you would rather I continue to send it by post. I do not want to presume that you would want to see me again. It has been 6 months, and you have probably moved on with your life. You probably barely remember the desperate woman you found praying in that church. But if you did want to see me again, I would like that very much. Please be honest with me, Samuel. I can bear many things, but I cannot bear false hope. Yours, Margaret. Samuel stared at that letter for a long time. His hands were shaking and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. She wanted to come back. She wanted to see him again. He grabbed a pen and paper and started writing before he could talk himself out of it. Dear Margaret, come back. Please come back. I think about you every single day. I have thought about you every day since I rode away from that stage depot in Salada. I told myself I had no right to hope for anything more than your letters, but if you are offering more, I want it. I want to see you again. I want to know if what I felt that day in the church was real or just my imagination. Come back to Colorado, Margaret. Come back and let me show you that I have not forgotten you for one single moment. I will be in Salada in April. I will wait for you there. Yours always, Samuel. He sent the letter express, paying extra to make sure it reached her quickly, and then he started making plans. He had saved most of the money Margaret had sent him, refusing to spend it when he knew how hard she had worked for it. Combined with his wages from the past 6 months, he had enough to make a down payment on a small piece of land near Salada. Nothing fancy, just 20 acres with a creek running through it and enough grass to support a small herd. Samuel bought the land in March and immediately started building. He worked from dawn until dark, cutting timber and hauling stones, building a cabin that was larger than he needed but that had space for a family someday, if he was lucky enough to have one. He told himself he was being a fool. Margaret had not promised him anything. She might arrive in Salada and hand him his money and thank him politely and walk away. But something in her letters, some quality he could not quite name, gave him hope. April arrived with warm sunshine and wildflowers blooming across the meadows. Samuel rode into Salada 3 days before Margaret was due to arrive, his stomach churning with nerves. He got a room at the boarding house, bathed and shaved, and bought a new shirt because his old ones were all worn thin from hard work. The morning the stage from Denver was due, Samuel was at the depot 2 hours early. He paced back and forth, checking his pocket watch every few minutes, until the other people waiting for the stage started giving him strange looks. Finally, he heard the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wheels, and the stage came rolling into view. Samuel's heart leapt into his throat as the coach stopped, and the driver climbed down to open the door. Dr. Adams emerged first, moving slowly but under his own power. He looked like a different man from the dying patient Samuel had helped into a stage 6 months ago. He had gained weight and color, and his eyes were clear and alert. Then Margaret stepped down, and Samuel forgot how to breathe. She was wearing a green dress that matched her eyes, and her honey-colored hair was pinned up in a style that was more sophisticated than he remembered. But it was the same woman, the same face that had haunted his dreams for 6 months. She looked around the depot, her eyes searching, and when she saw him, her entire face lit up with a smile so radiant it made Samuel's chest ache. "Samuel," she said. And then she was running toward him, propriety be damned, and Samuel was moving too, closing the distance between them in a few long strides. They crashed together like waves meeting shore, and Samuel wrapped his arms around her and lifted her right off her feet, spinning her in a circle while she laughed and cried at the same time. He set her down but did not let go, and she did not pull away, and they stood there in the middle of the depot, holding each other like they would never let go. "You came back," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "You actually came back." "Of course I came back," Margaret said, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Did you really think I could stay away?" "I hoped," Samuel admitted. "I hoped so hard it scared me, Doctor." Adams cleared his throat behind them, and Samuel reluctantly released Margaret and turned to shake the older man's hand. "You look well, sir," Samuel said. "Really well." "I feel well," Dr. Adams said warmly. "Better than I have in years, and I owe it all to you, son. You saved my life." "You would have done the same for anyone," Samuel said, but Dr. Adams shook his head. "Maybe I would have wanted to. But I have met a lot of men in my life, and very few of them would have actually done what you did. You gave up your dream for strangers. That is the definition of a good man." Margaret took Samuel's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Father has reopened his practice. We bought back our old building on Main Street. He is going to be the town doctor again." "That is wonderful," Samuel said, and meant it. "Salida needs a good doctor." "What about you?" Margaret asked. "Have you found another cattle-driving job?" Samuel felt his palms start to sweat. This was the moment. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times, but now, with Margaret looking at him with those green eyes full of hope and trust, all his carefully prepared words fled. "I bought land," he blurted out. 20 acres north of town. I built a cabin. It is not much yet, just 4 rooms, but it is solid. And there is a creek and good grass, and I thought I could start with a few head of cattle and build from there." "Samuel, that is amazing." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I am so happy for you. You are finally going to have your ranch." "Maybe," Samuel said, "if everything works out the way I hope." Something in his tone made Margaret pause. She studied his face, her expression shifting from joy to uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Samuel took a deep breath and looked at Dr. Adams. "Sir, I need to ask you something important." The older man's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I think I know what you are going to ask, son, but go ahead." Samuel turned to Margaret, still holding her hand. "When I heard you praying in that church, I told myself I was just helping someone in need. I told myself it was just kindness, nothing more, but that was not the whole truth." "What was the truth?" Margaret asked softly. "The truth is that I took one look at you, and I felt something I have never felt before. Something that scared me and excited me in equal measure. I tried to tell myself it would pass, that it was just infatuation or foolishness. But 6 months of letters later, I feel it even more strongly." Samuel dropped to one knee right there in the depot, not caring who was watching. Margaret gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "I love you, Margaret Adams," Samuel said, his voice clear and strong. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you kneeling at that altar. And I built that cabin for you with the hope that maybe, somehow, you might feel the same way. I am not rich and I cannot offer you an easy life, but I can offer you everything I am and everything I have. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Margaret's face, but she was smiling. "You love me more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I thought I was the only one," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was crazy for falling in love with someone through letters. But Samuel, I have loved you since that day in the church too." You were the answer to my prayers, but you became so much more than that. You became my whole world." "Is that a yes?" Samuel asked, hardly daring to hope. "Yes," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes, I will marry you." Samuel stood up and pulled her into his arms, and this time when he kissed her, right there in front of God and the whole town, it felt like coming home. Her lips were soft and sweet, and she kissed him back with a fervor that made his knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dr. Adams was grinning from ear to ear. "I take it I have your blessing, sir?" Samuel asked. "You had my blessing the moment I saw how you looked at my daughter 6 months ago," Dr. Adams said. "I knew even then that you were going to be part of our lives. I am just grateful she is smart enough to say yes." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Margaret insisted on a simple ceremony since Samuel could not afford anything elaborate, but the whole town turned out anyway. Everyone remembered how Samuel had helped the Adams family, and they wanted to celebrate the happy ending. They were married on a Sunday in May, in the same church where they had first met. Margaret wore a dress of ivory silk that she had made herself, and Samuel wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his hands shaking as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Samuel kissed his bride, he felt something settle in his chest, a feeling of rightness and completion that he had been missing his whole life without knowing it. They spent their wedding night in the cabin Samuel had built, and it was perfect. Margaret walked through the rooms, exclaiming over every detail, praising his craftsmanship and already planning where to put furniture and how to arrange the kitchen. Samuel followed her, watching the way she moved through the space, the way she touched the windowsills and door frames with reverent fingers. "It is perfect," she said finally, turning to face him. "I cannot believe you built all this for me." "I would have built a palace if I could have," Samuel said honestly. "You deserve so much more than this." Margaret crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "I do not want a palace. I want this. I want you. That is all I have ever wanted since I read your first letter." They fell into bed together, and Samuel made love to his wife with all the pent-up longing of 6 months of separation. She was everything he had dreamed of and more, responsive and passionate and completely his. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, talking and laughing and making plans for their future. "I want children," Margaret said, tracing patterns on Samuel's chest. "Lots of them. This cabin is big enough for a family." "As many as you want," Samuel promised, kissing her forehead. "I want to fill this house with noise and laughter." "And I want to help you build the ranch," Margaret continued. "I know you think ranching is men's work, but I am strong, Samuel. I can help." "I know you can," Samuel said. "We will build it together. Everything together from now on." True to their words, they worked side by side through that first year of marriage. Samuel took a job with a neighboring ranch to earn steady money, but every spare moment was spent improving their own land. They bought 3 cows and a bull, the start of their herd. Margaret planted a garden and tended chickens, and she took in sewing work to supplement their income. It was hard work, exhausting and sometimes frustrating. There were days when Samuel wondered if they were crazy to think they could make this work. But then he would come home tired and dusty, and Margaret would be waiting with dinner hot and a smile on her face, and he would remember why they were doing this. They were building something together, something that was theirs. In December, Margaret told him she was pregnant. Samuel picked her up and spun her around just like he had that day at the depot, both of them laughing and crying with joy. "A baby," Samuel kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though she could clearly see the answer on his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Samuel said. You have given me everything, Margaret. A home, a purpose, and now a child. How did I get so lucky? We both got lucky, Margaret corrected, kissing him. That day in the church, we both got our miracle. Their son was born in July of 1879, a robust baby with dark hair like Samuel's and green eyes like Margaret's. They named him Thomas, after Margaret's father, and Dr. Adams cried when they told him. Samuel had never known he could love anyone as much as he loved his son. He would stand over the cradle for hours, watching Thomas sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. Margaret would find him there and slip her arm around his waist, and they would stand together, watching their miracle. The ranch grew slowly but steadily over the next few years. By the time Thomas was 3, they had a herd of 20 cattle and had added rooms onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family. Margaret gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, in 1882, and another son, James, in 1884. The house rang with the sound of children's laughter, just as Samuel had dreamed. Money was always tight, and there were setbacks. A harsh winter in 1883 killed several head of cattle. A drought the following summer withered half their crops, but they persevered, leaning on each other and on the community they had built in Salida. Dr. Adams remained healthy, his recovery from consumption complete. He doted on his grandchildren and remained one of Samuel's closest friends and advisors. The older man often remarked that he had gained a son that day in the church, not just a son-in-law. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Margaret back to the church where they had first met. It was evening and the building was empty, lit only by the last rays of sunset streaming through the windows. "You remember what you were praying for that day?" Samuel asked, taking her hand as they stood at the altar. "A miracle to save my father," Margaret said. "I remember being so desperate, so afraid, I had lost all hope. And then I showed up," Samuel said with a smile. "And then you showed up," Margaret agreed. "My cowboy in dusty clothes with kind eyes and $600 in his saddlebags, the answer to my prayers. You know what the funny thing is?" Samuel pulled Margaret close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I always thought I was the answer to your prayer. But you were the answer to mine too. I just did not know it until I heard you crying." "What do you mean?" "I was lost, Margaret. Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from job to job with no real purpose. I had dreams of owning land, but that was all they were, dreams. You gave me a reason to make those dreams real. You gave me a reason to build something permanent." Margaret reached up and touched his face, her thumb brushing across his cheekbone. "We saved each other then." "I think we did," Samuel agreed. He kissed her softly, reverently, in the same spot where they had been married 5 years before. "Thank you for praying for a miracle that day. Thank you for letting me be the answer. Thank you for stopping," Margaret whispered against his lips. "Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for being the kind of man who would give up everything for a stranger." They stood there in the church as darkness fell around them, holding each other and reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From desperate prayer to answered miracle, from strangers to soulmates, from a small cabin to a growing ranch and a house full of children. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the ranch and the cattle. Sarah inherited her mother's skill with a needle and spent hours helping Margaret with sewing projects. James was the adventurous one, always getting into trouble but with such charm that no one could stay mad at him for long. In 1887, Margaret gave birth to twins, a boy and girl they named Daniel and Elizabeth. The cabin had to be expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and Samuel added 2 more rooms and a larger kitchen. It no longer looked like the simple four-room structure he had built 8 years ago. Now it was a real home, full of life and love and noise. The ranch prospered too. Samuel's reputation as an honest man and a skilled cattleman spread throughout the territory, and he was able to buy adjacent parcels of land, expanding their holdings to nearly 100 acres. He hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men who reminded him of himself at their age, full of dreams and determination. Margaret became known throughout Salida not just as the doctor's daughter or the rancher's wife, but as a woman of substance in her own right. Her sewing skills were in high demand, and she trained several young women in the craft, helping them earn their own income. She also worked alongside her father at his practice, assisting with patients and learning medicine. You could be a doctor yourself if they would let women into medical school, Dr. Adams told her one day as they stitched up a ranch hand who had been kicked by a horse. Maybe someday they will, Margaret said. And if not, I am content teaching my daughters that they can be anything they want to be. On their 10th anniversary, Samuel did something he had been planning for years. He had saved every penny Margaret had sent him during those first 6 months, the money she had worked so hard to earn to repay him. He had never touched it, keeping it separate from their other funds. That anniversary morning, he presented her with a small wooden box. "What is this?" Margaret asked, turning the box over in her hands. "Open it," Samuel said, smiling. Inside the box was money carefully wrapped in paper. Margaret gasped when she saw how much was there. "Samuel, this is nearly $200. Where did you get this?" "That is your money," Samuel explained. "Every dollar you sent me to repay the debt. I never spent any of it. I saved it for you." "But why?" Margaret looked up at him with confused eyes. "That money was supposed to repay you for what you gave us." "You repaid me in 1,000 other ways," Samuel said. "You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You gave me love. That is worth more than all the money in the world. This money represents your hard work and your determination. It should be yours to do with as you please." Margaret stared at the money, then at Samuel, then back at the money. Tears started streaming down her face. "You have been saving this for 10 years. I wanted you to have something that was just yours, something you earned yourself." Samuel wrapped his arms around her as she cried. "You are so much more than my wife, Margaret. You are your own person with your own dreams. Use this money however you want." Margaret used the money to open the dress shop she had always dreamed of. It was a small storefront on Main Street in Salida, next to her father's practice. She hired 2 assistants and began designing and making custom dresses for women throughout the county. The shop became successful quickly, and soon Margaret was not just supporting herself, but contributing significantly to the family finances. Samuel could not have been prouder. His wife was a business owner, a mother of 5, and still somehow found time to work on the ranch and spend evenings reading to their children. She was remarkable, and he told her so often. "I learned from the best," Margaret would say, kissing him. "You taught me that anything is possible if you work hard enough and have someone who believes in you." As the children grew older, Samuel taught them the values he and Margaret held dear: hard work, honesty, kindness to those in need. Thomas, the oldest, showed a natural talent for ranching and declared his intention to take over the operation someday. Sarah wanted to be a dress designer like her mother. James dreamed of being a lawman. The twins were still too young to know what they wanted, but they soaked up every lesson their parents taught them. One evening in the summer of 1890, after the children were all in bed, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch of their home, watching the stars come out over the mountains. Samuel had his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she was tucked against his side, her head resting on his chest. You ever think about that day in the church? Margaret asked softly. All the time, Samuel admitted. I think about how close I came to just riding past. I was tired and hungry and just wanted to get to the boarding house. If I had been a few minutes earlier or later, if the church door had been closed, if 1,000 different things had been different, we never would have met. Fate, Margaret said with certainty. It was fate that brought you to me exactly when I needed you most. Maybe, Samuel agreed. Or maybe it was just a cowboy who could not ride past the sound of someone in pain. He kissed the top of her head. Either way, I am grateful. Every single day I am grateful. Me too, Margaret said. She tilted her head up to look at him. You know what I think about sometimes? I think about the man you were before we met. The drifter with no roots, saving money for land but with no real reason to settle down. And then I look at the man you are now. A husband, a father, a rancher, a pillar of this community. You have become so much more than you ever planned to be. Only because of you, Samuel said. You made me want to be more. You made me want to build something permanent, something that would last. We built it together, Margaret corrected. Everything we have, we built together. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, the creek burbling over rocks, an owl hooting from the trees. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of home. Samuel, Margaret said eventually. Yes. Do you remember what you said to me that day when you offered to give me the money? Samuel thought back, trying to recall his exact words from 12 years ago. I think I said you needed it and I could help. You said more than that, Margaret said. You said that land would still be there next year and the year after that, but my father might not have that kind of time. You chose people over property. You chose compassion over ambition. That is why I fell in love with you, Samuel. Not because you gave me money, but because you showed me who you really were in that moment. Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. And who was I? You were a man who would give up his dreams to save a stranger. You were a man who understood that some things are more important than money or land or plans for the future. You were the kind of man I wanted to spend my life with. Margaret sat up and turned to face him directly. And you still are. Every day you show me that same kindness, that same compassion. Not just to me, but to our children, to our ranch hands, to everyone in this town. You are exactly the man I fell in love with, only more so. Samuel pulled her close and kissed her deeply, pouring 12 years of love and gratitude into that kiss. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I love you, Margaret Grant, Samuel said. More than the day I married you, more than the day before that. My love for you grows every single day. And I love you, Samuel Grant, my cowboy who became my miracle. They stayed on the porch until late into the night, talking and dreaming and planning. They talked about expanding the ranch further, about maybe buying the land to the south that had just come up for sale. They talked about their children's futures, about the grandchildren they hoped to have someday. They talked about growing old together on this land they had built together. It was the kind of conversation they had had hundreds of times before and would have hundreds of times again. But it never got old. Every dream they shared, every plan they made, was another thread in the tapestry of their life together. As the years rolled on, the Grant Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the county. Samuel's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread throughout Colorado and beyond. He was elected to the town council and became a trusted advisor to younger ranchers just starting out. He always remembered what it was like to be young and broke and full of dreams, and he went out of his way to help others the way he had helped Margaret and her father all those years ago. Margaret's dress shop thrived as well. She expanded into a larger building and hired more assistants. She developed a reputation for elegant designs and impeccable craftsmanship, and women came from as far as Denver to commission dresses from her. But she never forgot her roots, and she made sure to keep her prices reasonable so that ordinary women could afford her work too. Dr. Adams remained healthy and active well into his 70s, finally retiring from his practice in 1895. He spent his retirement years playing with his grandchildren and helping Margaret at her shop. He often remarked that the extra years he had been given felt like a gift, and he was determined not to waste a single day. Thomas, true to his word, took over more and more of the ranch operations as he got older. By the time he was 20, he was essentially running the day-to-day business, freeing Samuel to focus on expansion and business development. Thomas was a natural leader and a skilled cattleman, and Samuel knew the ranch would be in good hands when it was time to pass it on. Sarah opened her own dress shop in Denver after apprenticing with her mother for several years. She married a banker named Robert Morrison, and they had 3 children. She visited Salida often, and she and Margaret would spend hours talking about designs and fabrics and the latest fashion trends from the East. James did become a lawman, joining the county sheriff's office at 21. He had his father's strong sense of justice and his mother's compassion, and he quickly earned a reputation as a fair but firm enforcer of the law. He married his childhood sweetheart, Emma, and they built a house just down the road from the ranch. Daniel decided to become a doctor like his grandfather, studying at medical school in Chicago and returning to Salida to take over Dr. Adams's old practice. Elizabeth became a teacher, opening a small school on the ranch property where she taught not just the grandchildren but children from neighboring ranches as well. By the time Samuel and Margaret celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1903, they had 9 grandchildren and another on the way. The original cabin had been expanded and remodeled so many times it was barely recognizable, but the core of it, the 4 rooms Samuel had built with his own hands, remained intact at the heart of the house. For their anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. It seemed like the whole town turned out, along with friends and family from across the state. There was music and dancing and more food than Samuel had ever seen in one place. As Samuel watched his children and grandchildren laughing and playing, as he looked around at the ranch that had grown from 20 acres to nearly 500, as he felt Margaret's hand in his and saw the love shining in her eyes, he was overwhelmed with gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, leaning against him as they stood on the edge of the party, watching the festivities. "I am thinking about that day in Salida, 25 years ago. I am thinking about a desperate woman praying for a miracle and a cowboy who happened to have $600 in his saddlebags." Samuel pulled Margaret close. "I am thinking about how one moment, one decision to stop and help changed everything." "Are you glad you stopped?" Margaret asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. "It was the best decision I ever made," Samuel said. "Giving you that money, it felt like I was giving up my dreams. But what I did not understand then was that I was not giving anything up. I was just making room for better dreams, dreams I did not even know I wanted until I met you. We have built a good life, have we not?" Margaret said, looking out at their family and friends. "We have built an extraordinary life," Samuel corrected. "A life filled with love and purpose and meaning, a life that matters." Margaret turned in his arms to face him fully. "Do you know what the best part is? We still have so much more life ahead of us. More years together, more grandchildren, more memories to make. I plan to make the most of every single day," Samuel promised. "Every day with you is a gift." They danced together as the sun set behind the mountains, the same mountains that had watched over them for 25 years. They moved together with the ease of long practice, their bodies knowing each other's rhythms, their hearts beating in sync. When the party finally wound down and the last guests had gone home, Samuel and Margaret walked through their house, looking at all the evidence of their life together. Children's drawings pinned to walls, photographs in frames, Margaret's sewing projects scattered across tables, Samuel's ranch records stacked neatly on his desk. "We did all this," Margaret said wonderingly. "Two people who met by chance in a church, and we built all of this." "Not by chance," Samuel said firmly. "I will never believe it was chance. It was meant to be. You were meant to be praying in that church, and I was meant to hear you. We were meant to find each other." "You really believe that?" "I do," Samuel said. "I have to believe that something bigger than us brought us together. Because the alternative, the idea that I might have ridden past and never known you existed, that is too terrible to contemplate." Margaret kissed him, slow and sweet and full of love. "Then I believe it too. We were meant to be." The years continued to pass, bringing more joys and occasional sorrows. Dr. Adams passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1905, surrounded by his family. It was a hard loss, but Samuel and Margaret took comfort in knowing he had lived to see his grandchildren grown and his great-grandchildren thriving. They buried him on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple headstone that read, "Thomas Adams, beloved father and grandfather, healer of bodies and souls." Samuel's health remained strong through his 50s and into his 60s. He still worked the ranch every day, though he let Thomas handle more of the physical labor. Margaret continued to work at her dress shop, though she had trained a successor who would eventually take over the business. On their 40th anniversary in 1918, the family gathered again at the ranch for a celebration. This time, there were 18 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren, and the house was bursting at the seams with people. Samuel was 66 years old now, his dark hair gone silver, his face lined from years of sun and wind. But his eyes were still clear and bright, and when he looked at Margaret, they held the same love and wonder they had held 40 years ago. Margaret was 62, her honey-colored hair now white but still thick and beautiful. She moved with the same grace she had always had, and when she smiled, she looked like the young woman Samuel had fallen in love with in that church so long ago. After dinner, Samuel stood up and tapped his glass for attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. 40 years ago, Samuel began, his voice still strong, I was just a cowboy drifting through Colorado with no real plan and no real purpose. I had some money saved and a vague dream of owning land someday, but that was about it. Then one day in July I was riding through Salida, and I heard someone crying in a church. I almost kept riding. I was tired and it was not my business, but something made me stop. He looked at Margaret, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. I walked into that church and found a woman praying for a miracle. She needed $500 to save her father's life, and I happened to have $600 in my saddlebags, so I gave it to her. There were murmurs around the room. Most of the family knew the story, but they never tired of hearing it. At the time, I thought I was giving up my dreams to help a stranger, but what I did not realize was that I was not giving anything up. I was making room for something infinitely better. That woman became my wife. She became the center of my world, and together we built all of this. Samuel gestured around the room at his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A family, a legacy, a life worth living. He raised his glass. To Margaret, the woman who was praying for a miracle. You asked God for a way to save your father, and somehow, incredibly, I got to be the answer to that prayer. But you were the answer to my prayers too, even though I did not know I was praying. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Here is to 40 more years together, if we are lucky enough to get them. Everyone raised their glasses and cheered, and Margaret stood up and walked to Samuel, throwing her arms around him. He held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the familiar warmth of her body against his. "I love you," she whispered in his ear. "Then, now, and always." "And I love you," Samuel whispered back. "My miracle, my answer, my everything." They lived another 15 years together, growing old side by side on the ranch they had built. Samuel passed away peacefully in 1933 at the age of 81, with Margaret holding his hand, and his children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. His last words were, "Thank you for letting me love you." Margaret lived another 5 years, passing away in 1938 at the age of 82. With her last breath, she whispered Samuel's name, and her face held a smile that suggested she could already see him waiting for her on the other side. They were buried together on the ranch, next to Dr. Adams, on the hill overlooking the valley. Their shared headstone reads simply, "Samuel and Margaret Grant, united in love 1878–1933, together forever." The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's care and eventually passed to his children and his children's children. The dress shop in Salida became a landmark, preserved by the town as a historical building. And the little church where Samuel and Margaret had first met became a popular place for weddings, with couples coming from all over Colorado to be married in the spot where such an extraordinary love story had begun. The Grant family grew and flourished, spreading across Colorado and beyond. But they never forgot the story of their beginning, the story of a desperate woman praying for a miracle and a cowboy who happened to have $600 and a kind heart. They told the story to their children and their grandchildren, keeping alive the memory of two people who had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances and built something beautiful from it. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the money or the land or the success of the ranch and the business. What mattered was that two lost souls had found each other, had chosen to build a life together, and had created a legacy of love that would last for generations. Samuel Grant had stopped at a church one July day in 1878 because he heard someone crying. That simple act of compassion had changed two lives completely. Margaret had prayed for a miracle to save her father, and Samuel had become the answer she never expected. But in saving her, he had saved himself too, finding purpose and meaning and love beyond anything he could have imagined. Their story became legend in Salida, passed down through generations as an example of what could happen when someone chose kindness over convenience, when someone chose to stop and help rather than ride on by. It was a reminder that miracles could come in unexpected forms, that sometimes the answer to a prayer showed up wearing dusty cowboy clothes and carrying $600 in saddlebags. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go after they leave this world, Samuel and Margaret were together still, holding hands and watching over the family they had created, the ranch they had built, and the legacy of love they had left behind. They were proof that love could conquer anything, that one moment of compassion could change the world, and that sometimes, when you pray for a miracle, the universe listens and sends exactly what you need, even if it comes in a form you never expected. The church still stands in Salida, its white paint fresh and its doors always open. And on quiet days, when the wind blows just right through the Colorado mountains, some people swear they can still hear the echo of desperate prayers and the sound of boots on wooden floorboards, the ghost of a story that changed everything, the whisper of a love that never truly ended.